Hello, my name is Grant Sutliff, and today I'm going to talk to you about Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company, and the success of him and his company. But before I go into that, I want to talk to you about a special truck in my family that we had when I was a kid. It was a 1977 Ford F100 custom long bed pickup truck that my granddad bought brand new in 1977, and he had it all the way up until he ended up giving it to my father because he couldn't drive anymore. And that was sort of a really special thing that he did. My dad knew how much he loved that truck and decided to give it to my dad. And my dad always told him that he wouldn't sell the truck until he passed, and he ended up keeping that promise. We drove it all the time. I loved that truck. We had it straight piped, and it was a V8, and it sounded awesome, and it was a mechanically sound truck, never really broke down. And my granddad was sort of a great representation of a person who buys a Ford, someone who was a hardworking middle-class person, didn't buy all the expensive fancy things. And that's what Ford is about, having inexpensive cars that many sort of, if you will, regular people will buy. And my immediate family, as well as my family on my dad and mom's side, we've all had Fords for a while. My dad's first car was a Ford Mustang. My mom's first car was a Ford, and my first car was a Ford Ranger pickup truck. So speaking from personal experience when I'm talking about Ford owners and who they are, my whole family are Ford owners. And back to Henry Ford and how successful he was. He was really a great leader and a hard worker, and he built the Ford Motor Company from scratch. And the whole purpose of the Ford Motor Company was to build inexpensive cars and have many people be able to drive them, instead of having all the expensive cars like Cadillacs, Mercedes, BMW, cars like that. And the main point I'm going to talk about in this speech today is how Henry Ford is a great leader and an extremely successful businessman. He, how the Ford Motor Company represents his original views and values in the company. You can see it still today. And how Henry Ford's invention of the Model T was a legendary accomplishment, how it changed the automobile industry in this time. And a really good example of how Henry Ford was sort of a born leader, a natural leader, was when he was extremely young. He gathered a group of his friends, and he had them all build water wheels and steam engines. It ended up they failed in building them, but it shows a lot of leadership to at that young age to get a lot of people together and do something like that. And he was really successful as a businessman. I mean, during his lifetime, his introduction of mass production assembly line methods irrevocably changed the nature of manufacturing, something for which, for once, the use of the phrase paradigm shift is wholly justified. And the Ford Motor Company, last year in 2018, it reported revenues of just over $160 million in their fiscal year, which ended in December 2018. And Henry Ford himself died with a net worth of $200 billion, which is adjusted for inflation. So that's exactly how much he was worth at the time. And he really had some unique values that sort of made the Ford Motor Company as successful as they were. And their mission statement was to focus on affordable cars that everybody can drive, and that would allow them a big opportunity for growth in their company. And one of Henry Ford's values was sort of about how during hard times, you should endure them and battle through them, don't go around them. And that was really seen through the Ford Motor Company after he died in 2008. They refused the government bailout, which was, offering many different car dealerships TARP loans, which are Troubled Asset Relief Program loans, because there was a 30% fall in car sales that year. And GM and Chrysler both accepted the TARP loan, and Ford didn't, because they had already prepared for this by making, by cutting costs in the year before, so they wouldn't have to take loans. And that was sort of a big deal for me, and why I admired Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company so much. They didn't give into the government and take money from the government. And that's why my father also, he won't drive a Chevy or any GM car. He only wants to drive Fords because of that. And Henry Ford really did change the automobile industry, with his invention of the Model T. I found this in a book here about when they were developing the Model T. The Model T was a vehicle that revolutionized the automobile industry, it said, and it was the best seller when it was released in 1908 as a 1909 model. So it was extremely popular, and basically everybody was driving it because it was so affordable. Unlike, it was really the first affordable vehicle for people to buy and use. And, so basically that's the whole deal with Ford, is, having strong values that they've had ever since the beginning of their company, and having a car for, they're sort of the car company of the American people. But just to go over everything about them. So great inventor. He invented the Model T, which was legendary, and he was obviously extremely successful. Built everything from the ground up. He was actually born dyslexic, and so he had a bunch of hurdles that he had to overcome, and he did. And for my concluding thought about sort of a Ford vehicle, is I see it as sort of like this shotgun here that was passed down from my dad to me. So Ford is, something that's extremely reliable, and you can pass down to your, the younger generation. It'll last for a long time, just like my granddad did with my dad, and and then to me, really, because I drove it for a little while. So that's summarization exactly of who Henry Ford was and the Ford Motor Company.